Thank you for joining us during these challenging times. My name is Sean Allingham and I'm the chapter leader for the BCI New South Wales chapter. I welcome you to the next session. I will do a brief introduction and then hand you over to our speakers. In an environment of increasingly complex shocks and stresses, resilience promises a way of thinking to prepare for and recover from disruption. In most cases, infrastructure, organisational and community resilience building activities operate independently of each other, which may prevent us from reaching our true resilience potential. In their presentation, Renae, Chris and Margaret will propose that the best way forward is together, using shared techniques, pooling resources, developing unified approaches and sharing the benefit from the results produced to provide truly unified and sustainable resilience. A little bit about the speakers. Renae Hanvin is the founder of Corporate to Community and known for doing disasters differently by leading private sector contribution before, during and after disasters. Quin is the Director of Resilient Projects, a project consultancy dedicated to reducing disaster risk and improving the resilience of infrastructure, organisations and communities. Dr Margaret Moreton founded Lever Consulting, building on her community-based research about community resilience following disasters. She works with governments, agencies and communities to enhance community resilience and maximise community voice and leadership before and after disasters and other emergency events. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted unless you are sent a request to unmute it. If you have questions or comments, we would encourage you to type them into the questions or comments box and I'll ask the presenters on your behalf at the end of the session. As we have three presenters, I would ask that you please identify whether the question should be directed at Renae, Chris or Margaret. This webinar will be recorded and available for future reference on the BCI website. We ask for your patience today as we are relying on the internet and are conducting the virtual summit for the first time. I will now hand over to Margaret, who will do an acknowledgement to country and start the presentation.
Thanks very much, Sean. So before we begin, as Sean mentioned, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, which of course is extensive. So with apologies for any mispronunciation, Chris is joining us from the Waguru, Kabar and the Bindal people country. Renae is joining us from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'm joining you from the Wadawurrung people's land in the Kulin Nation. So Renae and I are both in Victoria and Chris is in Queensland. And I welcome everybody to the session from wherever you are across Australasia, from wherever you're located. And I pay my respects to all of you and the wealth of experience that you bring to the discussion we hope to have with you. So before we begin, I would like you to just take a moment to think. So I'm just going to pause in a second. I'd like you to think about how much you would normally consider organisational resilience, infrastructure resilience, or community resilience in your role as you undertake your role and do your work. Just make a mental note of whether you think about all three of these, never, which would be sad for us, or exciting, perhaps sometimes or infrequently, or all the time you're across it and you are a fan of all three. And you may note in your own mind some differences between the three. So we just want you to take that moment, think about that question, and we'll come back to it at the end. So assuming you know your own answers, we're not asking you to confess to everybody. We'll start our slides. So we are addressing, all of us actually, an unusual world at the moment, a world of many hazards. And as you can see from this diagram, which we will return to a few times in our presentation, there are a lot of hazards across the top of that image that affect all of us who live in communities, be they urban, regional, rural, remote, or sometimes with family and friends in any and all of those places. And as you can see from the hazards we've included, there are a great many, and we're all living under COVID in various ways. But there are also other hazards. And I've been working in the last couple of days in particular with communities who have had bushfires, COVID, and they're now under flood as of the last few days. So sometimes these are multiple simultaneous who'd live in Australia. If only we could say the rest of the world was different, but moving on.
Thanks, Margaret. My name's Renae Hanvin. I'm the founder of Corporate to Community, and I'm going to present today a few slides relating to organisational resilience. So obviously, as Margaret has mentioned, we're in a very different world at the moment, and there's never been a more important time for businesses to be thinking about how resilient they are and how ready they are and how they're adapting to the various disasters that we have right now and then also coming ahead. So I'm not going to talk about the processes from business continuity, obviously, because you're all experts far more than I am. What I do want to talk about is organisational resilience and the sense of the role that businesses and organisations can play. So you might have seen or heard of the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience. And in this document that was created in 2011, so nearly 10 years ago, there's a notion of shared responsibility. And it articulates that we all have a shared responsibility to build resilience. So businesses, individuals, communities, and the alike. And it says businesses play a really fundamental role in the shared responsibility of disaster resilience. And I think it's important to note that all types of businesses play that role. So whether you're from a critical infrastructure organisation or a small business, we all have a role to play. And understanding what that role is and how it contributes to a shared outcome is really important. And we're obviously seeing that with COVID. But the fact is, at the moment, we all work very much in silos from an organisational perspective. And I think one of the focuses we all need to think about in the roles that we play is how can we expand the siloed focus and how can we start thinking more holistically. Now, this next slide is what I like to showcase in the sense that, you know, business continuity, you guys really are the leaders and the drivers and the experts in the organisations when it comes to disasters and responding to disasters. And that's not to take away from the other business functions like risk management, etc. But currently in most organisations, as I mentioned before, there's a siloed group of business continuity experts who are the experts, but it sits very much in that space and in that field. What we need to move towards, and given the current compound disasters, and I talk about the future era of disasters we're going to face, which we're actually facing now, is disaster resilience from an organisational perspective needs to be holistic across the organisation. So the organisation that you're in needs to start thinking differently and thinking more holistically across all their business functions about all types of risks, vulnerabilities, and impacts from disasters. But it's a great opportunity for business continuity leaders to really drive that across the business. Like, it's almost your time to shine. There are enough disasters happening in the world that I think it's a great opportunity for executive leaders and CEOs to look at the business continuity functions and enable them to lead and drive it through the other parts of the business. But in doing so, it's not just about your organisation. It's so important for organisations when they're building their resilience to consider and integrate customers, suppliers, and communities. Because if you can broaden the holistic approach to resilience so that your customers are more resilient, then that means they can buy more products and services from you. If your suppliers are more resilient, they can obviously supply more products and services to you. So it's a new approach. And again, it's a really big opportunity for business continuity to lead a new movement towards resilience. Now, the outcomes of an organisation that integrates a holistic approach to resilience are high. So most organisations are probably at the low or the medium resilience levels where it's very siloed focused. They don't figure how it works or think about how it aligns with reputation. And these days, brand equity and reputation is everything. And while the cost savings beforehand might be less, the actual costs when you're recovering and responding to the disasters are higher. So organisations, and there's a couple of examples I'm going to share later, organisations that integrate a high thinking of resilience, have a high holistic focus across their business, have much greater reputation opportunities in a positive way for their organisations. And the savings of recovery costs will be higher too. So financially, they'll be better off. Brand reputation, they'll be better off. So the outcomes will be more positive. Now, I think a really easy way to think about it is to take or put a new take on the typical triple P bottom line. So a lot of organisations obviously have a focus of the planet and the people and the profits, and sustainability typically is what sits in the middle. So I'm going to challenge you all to put resilience in the middle as well. Resilience is not sustainability, so it's different, but it can absolutely sit in parallel. It has its own processes and systems and needs, but it should absolutely be part of the strategic epicenter of your culture and your leadership for all organisations, because given the disasters we have and the ones that are coming ahead, resilience is so important to all elements of business function. Now, a lot of businesses focus on promoting to shareholders. So obviously those who are your shareholders are those who you primarily focus on. I'm going to challenge everyone who's listening and also ask you to challenge your CEOs and executive teams to broaden that, to focus on your shareholders. Because if you put more focus into your employees and your customers and your suppliers and your community through your own processes and systems by building organisational resilience, the outcome is going to be better all around. We can't have resilient and thriving organisations and businesses if we don't have resilient and thriving communities and suppliers and customers. Now, in terms of, back to the picture that Margaret introduced us to at the start, so this is not going to be a competition between the three speakers and who has the best case, but I think it's really interesting and important to show that organisational resilience and strong businesses contributing to strong communities, also through infrastructure, can really support our communities before, during and after the myriad of disasters that are ahead. And now I'm going to pass over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Renae. I was really intrigued by what Renae was saying about moving from an attitude of looking after shareholders to stakeholders. I think that's really important. And although I respect Renae's view on organisational resilience, I'm sure you'll agree by the end of my part of the presentation that infrastructure resilience is at least as important. So let's get on with it. A really brief introduction to infrastructure resilience. For those who aren't familiar with it, and I apologise to those that are, infrastructure resilience is a concept. I mean, this is a model that was put out by the UK government about 10 years ago now. It's the concept of keeping infrastructure running effectively. It's that service from infrastructure that we're keen to keep running during all types of conditions, not just when it's sunny and things are going really well, but during all types of conditions. And the way that we do that is focusing on effectively 4 different realms. Resistance is what people think of when they initially start thinking about infrastructure resilience. This is concrete and steel solutions. This is effectively hardening infrastructure to make sure that it's available at times when there might be high wind or high temperatures or whatever it is that could affect that infrastructure. But increasingly we've focused across the last 10 years on the other aspects of infrastructure resilience as well. So reliability is that ability to operate in a variety of conditions. So when it's really cold, when it's really hot, when it's really windy, when it's really calm, those sorts of other conditions, and those conditions can even be market conditions, not necessarily just natural ones, but having a high reliability allows us to function in a variety of conditions. Redundancy is more, it's a focus beyond a physical asset, a physical infrastructure asset, and starting to look at a system, the system that delivers the service to the community. And we start to think about, if we lose a component of the network, how can we manage that? And one way is redundancy. We build redundancy into the network to allow us to continue providing a service, whether it's 100% service or 75 or 50% service, but we don't just completely lose the service if there's some sort of threat or hazard that impacts the infrastructure. And another one that's not often considered when we talk about infrastructure resilience, because we are focused on assets quite a lot, is response and recovery, which really dovetails with organisational resilience. It's how to get the organisation and the infrastructure service back up and running as quickly after disruption as we possibly can. And there are hard solutions for that, infrastructure-based solutions, but there are also systems, processes. This is all stuff that as business continuity experts, I'm sure you're very well aware of. Those softer solutions can be just as effective, even if not more so, in getting that service back up and running. But it's probably a little bit more complicated than that. And to illustrate the complexity of infrastructure, I want to talk to you about your coffee. Or it might be tea, or it might be some other drink, but you recently bought from a cafe, perhaps not so recently in some locations. But for that coffee, I'm going to focus on coffee, but think of any drink that you enjoy. You've bought that at a shop. There are 4 main infrastructure chains that provided that coffee to you. And so for coffee, you need beans, you need water, you need electricity, and you need someone to make it. You need a barista or some other expert to actually supply that coffee. And that sounds kind of simple, but the way those things get to the location where you bought them is actually really complicated. So when you think about the beans, they were grown overseas. They used a transport network to get to a port. They used an overseas transport system, a ship, usually a container ship, to get across the ocean to wherever the destination is that you bought your coffee. Again, unloaded with a piece of port infrastructure, transported to a manufacturing facility where they were ground and roasted, and then transported again by road to where they were used. That's just the beans. When you start thinking about the water was caught in a basin, some sort of catchment, a dam or reservoir, open air reservoir usually, and stored as a bulk water supply. It was transmitted through a transmission pipeline to a water treatment plant, and at that water treatment plant was treated, stored in local reservoirs, and then distributed using another pipe network. And again, you can imagine how complex that might be, and gets increasingly complex with your distance from the bulk storage of the water. When we start talking about electricity, the network looks a little bit similar to the water network, but is just as complex, possibly more so. You need the fuel to generate the electricity, and in this case, I've got a picture of coal, but that could be anything. That could be gas. We mostly use coal in Australia now, but increasingly, which is great, we're transitioning to other fuel sources such as sun and wind, and also hydroelectricity, which Tasmania has been doing for a long time very well. You need a generator, and then again a transmission network. Those are the really tall pylons you see up in the sky, transmitting at high voltages in long distances, and then that step down using transformers into a distribution voltage. Those are the wires that you see around towns and suburbs, and then step down again so that you can use it as your 240 volts that comes out of the wall to power your coffee machine, because you're not making coffee without the coffee machine. And the last thing that we need in this complex chain of infrastructure is a transport network, because your barista or your expert that makes the coffee for you generally is coming from one place to another. Where they live and where they work are the same place. Might be a road network, might be a train network, they might use a bike. Either way, you need all sorts of things to make that happen. You might need fuel, you might need electric signals for either the train system or the road system. So you can see, just to get that $5, I hope you're not paying too much more than $5, that $5 cup of coffee, there's an incredibly complicated and complex system that sits behind that to provide that service to you. But unfortunately, it's not even as simple as that. And our next slide shows that all of these infrastructure systems that sit underneath the basic infrastructure that we were talking about, they're all really heavily connected. So, for example, your water system doesn't work without electricity. You need electricity for your pumps and motors to push the electricity uphill to the reservoirs and to treat the water so that it's available to drink. You need water for cooling, for electricity, especially when you're talking about a raw resource like coal. You have to cool that with water, and water is actually what produces the steam that generates the electricity. You need communication systems to be able to work the electricity network and the transport network, and equally you need electricity to run those communications networks. So it starts to get really, really complicated. You're not just dealing with a single piece of infrastructure whenever you access any of these services. So those complicated and interconnected elements of all of those different infrastructure systems, they can really, as I'm sure you're aware, really elevate the possibility of disruption. A break in one can really quickly cascade and snowball into multiple outages in multiple sets of infrastructure. So we need to be really cognizant of that complexity as we're working through this. But there's hope. What we need to think about is infrastructure not as concrete and steel, but as a service. So we want the coffee, and there may be better ways to provide that coffee. That might be locally produced electricity in microgrids. It might be people who live more locally to their work. We're seeing that in the face of COVID, there's an adjustment there. And it can be the same with the other elements as well. The supply chains can be shortened, and therefore the disruption can be reduced. And that's true of the coffee, but it's also true of all sorts of things. So you have seen in your own experience in responding to the corona crisis, it's not the meeting rooms or the offices that we care about. It's actually the communications and the productivity. And what we're doing here today is exactly what I'm talking about. We've adapted to a complex and complicated situation and found an alternative solution. So that's a good way in which infrastructure can adapt and support our communities and organisations. Infrastructure resilience by itself, as we'll see on the next slide, doesn't always, I was about to say, the need for this is absolutely imperative. It's super urgent. We will build more infrastructure in the next 20 years than we have in all of human history. So it's really important that we start embedding resilience right at the start. When we're building new infrastructure, when we're redesigning infrastructure, when we're maintaining infrastructure, we need to be integrating resilience and sustainability, thinking about how we build the infrastructure and why we build it as well, what we're actually trying to supply. And the United Nations last year, the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, had a great hashtag, which was build to last. So instead of just building it to a code or a standard, we build it to last. We think about the set of conditions that this infrastructure will have to sort of absorb over the life of the infrastructure, which might be as much as 120 years in the case of bridges, or longer. We need to think about those future conditions and build our infrastructure to last. And before we move on, just a couple of quick examples of what happens when infrastructure resilience works in isolation. This isn't the bridge, but it's a picture of the bridge to remind me of the story. But in Queensland, we're Australia's most disaster-prone state, I guess. We're the most exposed. We have more hazards than any other state, and because of that, we sometimes have fails. And in this case, this bridge was washed out by a flood. The bridge was rebuilt. A flood came along, washed it out again. Another flood came along, washed it away again. It was the fourth time that it was rebuilt. But instead of just looking at rebuilding the bridge to the current engineering standards in the same location, we moved the bridge. We moved it to a different location. We adjusted the road network around it. And then a larger flood came along and didn't wash out that bridge. So it's about building for future conditions, not just looking at the current conditions and looking at really large natural hazards as just outliers, because as we've discussed, the future is a hazard-prone place. Same thing with the water treatment facility. Thankfully, it wasn't 4 times, it was 3 times, which still isn't great, but the water treatment, the bulk water intake, was washed away during a severe flood, and then washed away again when it was rebuilt in the same location. So they moved it upstream. And then a larger flood came along, and instead of being out for days and days and days, this main supply of water for a large regional town was back up and running within 30 minutes. So if we just apply some of the thinking, not just thinking about infrastructure resilience, but thinking about what the community needs, we can do much better than these 2 examples. And we'll give you some examples a little bit later that show a better, holistic, unified resilience attitude in action. So very lastly, we'll have a look at that image again. And what we see when we start building the infrastructure in, I sort of see this middle layer, the infrastructure resilience, the org resilience, the community resilience, as a defence against the hazards that we've got at the top of the page. So you can see the picture is starting to grow, and that we're seeing some elements of the defence against these hazards, and hopefully continued infrastructure service. Thanks very much. It's time for Margaret.
Thank you, Chris. There's so much, I want to ask questions, and I'm one of the presenters. So there's so much in both Renae and Chris's contributions. Anyway, moving on. So my area of specialty is community resilience. And as Sean said in the intro, I do work at all levels of our system in emergencies at government, non-government, federal, state, local levels. I have to say I'm most grateful for something that I had no control over in my life at all, and that is that I was born in a small country town and I grew up in a small country town. And I am regularly reminded of that and grateful that I understand how small country towns work. Communities, of course, can be anywhere. They can be in urban, regional, rural, remote countries, and all across Australasia. You'll all be able to identify a community that you feel you belong to. There are communities online in the virtual world, all sorts of forms and variations of community. I chose this particular picture for this slide because it is an Australian community and it is a community affected by recent bushfire. And I love it because there's kids, there's people who are older, there's, I can speculate, we're guessing, of course. I know who some of these people are, sisters, mothers, brothers, fathers, sons, grandchildren, so we go on. So communities are the vehicle and the focus for building resilience, and community resilience is a very strong protective factor if there is a crisis or an emergency of some kind, in the same way that infrastructure resilience and business resilience and business continuity are relevant. Community resilience and community continuity, I would argue, you can see there's a slightly competitive edge going between the three of us, is kind of the point, because all of these other systems are built for communities and in order to enable communities to live, to grow, to thrive. So we're largely social animals, multi-generational and diverse. We live, we work, we contribute to our communities in many ways, not just in simple linear ways. And most communities I work with will talk about the future and the children and grandchildren, and for people who are not yet born, which leads us to that whole sustainability and long-term view. We have purchasing power, we have political power in a democracy. So people is the focus of community. So then we have to ask ourselves, what is community? How can we understand community in a bit more detail? And initially, for the uninitiated, it's pretty straightforward. Individuals, households and families live in often a place or have a shared interest and connect with one another virtually or in other ways. There might be different socioeconomic groups, there might be different cultural groups, there'll be different parts of town, you know, there's east and west and north and south and everything that goes with that. And people are at different stages of their life. So you think, yeah, that's kind of what community is. But let me make it worse. So inside all of that, I'm waiting for the reveal of the next slide. Inside all of that, you'll see there's more. So systems is a common element between the three of us, that there are systems in our segment and the systems interrelate and overlap with one another, both within each of our presentations and also between us all, hence the picture at the end. So in the system of communities, we have a whole range of local businesses and they may be connected to one another. You can read the slide. We have local council usually, there's schools, primary, secondary, sometimes tertiary. There's libraries and neighbourhood houses and community centres, and there's Rotary. For those of you who don't know Rotary, you can Google it later. There's Rotary and Lions and the CWA. There are lots of different ways that people in communities interact that reflect their own diversity as individuals and also create a sense of community for the people who are connecting to one another, whether virtually or in the real sense. So you can see now that if you're trying to work in a field that builds community resilience or begins to build strategies for community continuity, if I can use that term, then you can see that all of these different elements will be in play. Now, it's also important to note that this picture, if we were to unpack it into great detail, will vary from community to community. So the whole one size fits all, we all say little mantras. So one size doesn't fit all. And I mean it really, because every community will have a different combination, different emphasis on these sorts of features. So let's go another step further. We're unpacking layer upon layer of community here. And look at the work of someone called Daniel Aldrich. So Daniel's work really unpacks the concept of social capital. So if, as I'm proposing, most of us are inherently social beings and we may be more or less gregarious, but we are inherently parts of systems in families, in groups of people who are like us and in communities, then there are three concepts in the social capital work. Bonding capital, if you look at the three different coloured dots, this is a very simple representation. Those green dots have bonding capital with one another, reasons why they have something in common. And then there is bridging capital, where someone might actually have something in common with the green dots and something in common with the red dots. And on a Tuesday, they'll go to choir, and on a Thursday, they'll go to land care. And they'll be in different groups, but they'll have a bridging role. And then there are, and I'm very keen to explore this with you, there are linking or social connectors, linking capital. And I would imagine that a number of businesses would fit this mould. Those grey dots where the community I was speaking with yesterday have lost their community hall. I always find lost a strange term, but anyway, the community hall burned down over summer, and it is previously where everybody went for events. Now, COVID aside, the loss of that hall means they've lost their place to spend time together, and it's affecting the quality of that community's recovery. It might be the stall, it might be the pub, it might be the footy club, it might be the church. So depending, there may be numbers of them in the one community. So these concepts are really useful when thinking about how to enhance community resilience and how to build in, ahead of needing to build in plans for continuity for communities to bounce back, another term I actually hate. It's a bad day if I use two in the one situation. But anyway, so to build those things in ahead of time, to work out how we can move to recovery and renewal more quickly and more effectively. So moving on again, there's a program that I just wanted to share with you. It's called the 100 Resilient Cities. If you haven't heard of it, I again suggest Google. The Rockefeller Foundation funded a program in 100 cities internationally, had to apply to be part of the program. Both Sydney and Melbourne applied and were successful. So both Sydney and Melbourne in Australia have had 100 resilient programs, Chief Resilience Officers, which sounds like the coolest title ever. And the Rockefeller Foundation identified 14 characteristics of a resilient community or a resilient city. And I think they're very useful. Now, I have taken the liberty, we've colour-coded them, because you'll notice that the three of us, Renae, Chris and I, have used different colours. So if we just look at the infrastructure colours, which are the navy blue, you'll see that the Rockefeller Foundation identified 2 characteristics, which I've chosen to say are primarily infrastructure, that are necessary in any resilient city, or in my case, I'm now saying in any resilient community. Now, if you look at the pale blue, then economic prosperity and the role of the economy is central, absolutely central, which is why it's in the centre, to any resilient city or community. And the green ones are spread out there, what I consider to be community-based. Now, we could argue quite successfully and interestingly about which goes in which colour. Security and justice could be one or more things, but the history and place, the health and well-being, the social capital, the diversity, inclusion, they're all concepts that are very important in the work that I do in community resilience, and so I've seized them. And the grey ones, I think, overlap a number of us. So again, we could probably have interesting conversations. But it's just a really nice snapshot of 14 characteristics of resilience that actually do unify the 3 streams that we've come from, Renae, Chris and I. So moving on, very aware of the time, we would like to share some examples with you of how, no, I can't go past our magic slide. So the green pictures are, of course, the community resilience icons or images. And it was absolutely a fun part of preparing for our presentation was choosing how to represent the diversity that is community. So moving on to the next slide after that. We would like to share with you a couple of stories each about unified resilience, and I get to go first and then I'll stop talking for a little while. So I've chosen 2 examples. The image on the left is intended to represent Food Bank, and the image on the right clearly states it represents Blaze Aid. Now, a very quick snapshot of both examples. Food Bank provides more than 70% of the food for relief organisations across Australia, and Food Bank is very visible after emergency events or large-scale crises, and Food Bank represents the kind of infrastructure chain that Chris outlined. Farmers and growers make the food, there are manufacturers and suppliers, wholesalers and retailers. Some of our large organisations are involved in distributing the food. Community groups get together and help by having community events and dinners pre-COVID. Schools and charity partners are involved. So Food Bank is an entire system of its own and of itself that relies on strong infrastructure, relies on communities and relies on businesses to actually work. I'll leave it that short for the moment. Blaze Aid is a concept that was born out of the 2009 bushfires here in Victoria, and it is now a nationwide program and provides support to communities all across the country. Even though it was born in fire, it does operate in other hazards. I don't know if you heard my computer bing. And Blaze Aid involves a whole bunch of volunteers. So again, there are systems of people involved in Blaze Aid, a whole bunch of volunteers from across the country, many of them retirees. They travel, they build fences. So two farmers had this concept. After a fire, you lose your fences. If you lose your fences, you can't restrain your stock. You can't get back on your feet. So Blaze Aid basically is a whole system of big, large-scale suppliers of fencing materials, Rotary clubs and Lions clubs doing community engagement and feeding the volunteers building the fences. It's a brilliant concept and it works extremely well to help recovery. And I think I shall stop speaking there.
Thanks, Margaret. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples from an organisational resilience perspective, and both of these are from America, but I think they give a really clear overview and some great examples. The first one is Waffle House, which is a waffle fast food chain open 24/7. And it's down the East Coast around Florida, where obviously is the hurricane, they have all the hurricane seasons. And the Waffle House quickly identified that they could play a really important role in the communities around what level of response or recovery communities at. So the Waffle House has created a menu that's basically for hurricane season. So they have set up all the infrastructure relating to their supply chains, etc., in terms of how they can keep serving and keep operating when a disaster happens or when a hurricane happens. And they've organised it right down to the fact if the only thing they serve is water, then they exist and they stay open to serve water. Now, in the process of creating that, they have built the most amazing connections with their local communities and including emergency services organisations. So they know that Waffle House, if anything's going to be open, Waffle House will be open. So the trust and reputation that they've built is enormous. But in doing that too, what they've actually become is an unofficial metric for FEMA, which is the US equivalent of Emergency Management Australia, or the state equivalents we have here. And basically, if a Waffle House is closed, it goes to red. And that means that community is really struggling and the community is basically closed, no one can get anywhere. If a Waffle House is orange, then depending on what they're serving, they basically can share what lines of infrastructure or supply chains or accessibility there is to that community. So it's a really great case example for organisations to look at and think about how being open and staying open can actually mean so much more than just bringing in profits, etc. It can be a really big place and a big part of the community during recovery and rebuild. The second example quickly is Walmart. So Walmart is obviously a retail supply chain, a retail department store, sorry, that's all around America. Now, prior to Hurricane Katrina, they were basically going under. So their profits were not going great and they were nearly forced to close. Because of how they responded and the role they determined for their organisation to play in response to Hurricane Katrina, and this comes from leadership and executive team, and I'm sure business continuity had an element of it as well, they've actually turned their whole business around, and they're now one of the most profitable and trusted brands in America. And they did it because they identified what role they could play to support the communities. So if you look at previous hurricane seasons, Walmart, they have processes and systems as to how to partner with local petrol stations. They have a supply line of petrol just for their employees, so they can enable their employees to get to work. They also reallocate their employees to other stores. So if an employee has a car, they can go here to get petrol, they can go to another store to keep working. They have set up open slathers and lots of product and donation systems, etc., for the local community. So if the local community needs water, Walmart is a place you can get it. So again, it's a really good example of an organisation and how they have looked at the infrastructure and the processes and the systems and what role they can play to support the community before, during and after disasters. Now, another example closer to home that I just wanted to share, I was on a few conference calls with a lot of the supply chain and the retail supermarkets. And a lot of the conversations were individual organisations saying, well, our processes and systems only do this and our processes and systems only do that. But the reality was there were a lot of small stores in bushfire impacted communities, but because of the COVID toilet paper saga, we're not getting the likes of essential products that they needed for their communities. So part of these conversations, I basically integrated the conversation and flipped it on its head to say, okay, well, how can we work together and get these items into these communities? So again, it enabled, and it not forced, but it enabled the process and systems people from those organisations to think differently and look to a community solution outcome. So then they could adapt the process and systems they had or work better together to deliver it. And the last one I just want to share, which I think has just been extraordinary in response to the bushfires, is the organisations and how they have supported through corporate social responsibility or paying phone bills for our emergency volunteers and workers, is the role, really important role that organisations can play that are above and beyond their everyday business as usual when disasters happen. And again, it's an area that business continuity can think about and lead, because you know the processes and systems. So you can think about the ways and what opportunities there might be for the brand to support greater infrastructure or to support those in our community that are helping to save us and respond to these disasters the most.
Okay, two more examples before we move on to question time. So start your questions, start firing your questions in if you like. And I apologise, I may have had a little bit of poor sound quality before, so I'll hold this up and hopefully it's a little bit better now. The example I'd like to give here is effectively a criticality assessment, which sounds very infrastructure, and it is very infrastructure. But these two organisations did a fantastic job of really considering the community's needs. So in regional Queensland, a water provider and an electricity provider got together and considered how long it would take for a community to really feel the pinch to be not supplied with water. And they started setting out priorities for that, very simple 1 to 3 priority system, and you'll have your own priority systems in your own organisations. But the key is that they communicated it. So they communicated it between the organisations in the form of spreadsheets and maps, so that when the electricity provider was restoring services after a natural hazard, predominantly cyclones in North Queensland, they could ensure that the water network was prioritised and really elevated in their restoration plans, so that they got the attention that was needed as quick as possible. It sounds simple, but the amount of logistics involved in both working that out, listing out the assets, prioritising them, but then sharing that and executing on that and affecting both of those organisations is a great example of organisational resilience really underpinning infrastructure resilience, which of course flows on to community resilience. Without water, Matthew Harper was speaking this morning, daycare centres can't run without water, we know hospitals can't run without water, so we know how vital it is. In so much electricity is vital, so is water in this particular instance. So the next example I'd like to show you is one where I sort of feel like it's really all coming together. So we've got infrastructure resilience, organisational resilience, and community resilience. And in fact, I was at what the Queensland Reconstruction Authority called a big map workshops. I was at one of these on Monday, and it's great. There's a map laid out. You can see from the image there, everybody walks the map effectively and puts down sticky notes where they believe this picture is a pre-COVID picture, so there's no physical distancing there. But we walked the map and we described the stories, previous flooding, previous events, the things that happen, but also we start to think about what we're going to do for the next event. And Margaret's terminology, community continuity, it's a phrase we've borrowed from Anne Ledbetter in Victoria, and it's a great concept because we talk about business continuity, that's effectively focusing on organisations, and we talk about infrastructure service and criticality and keeping the infrastructure running, which is effectively infrastructure continuity, but we don't always talk about community continuity, and that is the point. So bringing all those things together, getting the feedback from the community, it's great going to these big map workshops and seeing the mayor and the councillors and all the infrastructure managers, along with the graziers and the people from the community, they've got their shoes off, you walk on the map in your socks, and everybody is on a pretty much level playing field, contributing their information so that we can build better resilience strategies for communities. So we gather the information. One of the things we're introducing into this process is a business continuity concept, a fantastic one of recovery time objectives for bits of infrastructure within the community. How long can you survive without fuel? How long can you survive without energy? How long, when does it really start to hurt if the hospital has to be closed? And how long can you function in a community without water? And so understanding the community allows us to feed that information back through the organisations and to the infrastructure so that we can provide a better resilience solution for these communities. So a great option. You can see there's icons around there of all types of different infrastructure, including school infrastructure. It's incredibly important. And you'll see a link to my favourite down at the bottom, the coffee. Without that, everything stops, right? So I think we can probably move on. This is the terrific graphic that we wanted to see. We really wanted to see effectively the bringing together of all of the different elements we're talking about. As I said earlier, I think building resilience, in the same way we sometimes build vulnerability, we would much prefer to build resilience to these hazards. It takes a unified approach. And when we work together, you can see the lines of defence are that much stronger and we're that much more resistant to the hazards, and we have a better resilience outcome, and hopefully communities that can get on the path to recovery and build in resilience for the next hazard. We know it's coming, so we start to build resilience for the next hazard right in the space of recovery. So I think we're just about at question time. Great, you'll see on the Q&A page there that we've got our pictures, we've got our details. If you don't feel like asking a question now, we're absolutely more than happy for you to send us an email. Our email addresses are there and available to you. But if you would like to ask a question inside of this event, feel free to direct it to one of us, or we can direct it to all of us, and we'll be very, very pleased to have a Q&A session with you right now. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Chris, Renae and Margaret. While people are just starting to type in questions, we don't have anything specific at the moment, but I haven't had lunch yet and I'm feeling like maybe I could do with a waffle. So after hearing that, thank you. I have to find something equivalent. If I can just ask a question personally, some practical advice for a practitioner. We have a lot of practitioners on the call. So for those that are working probably with limited resources, they might just be responsible for the business continuity function solely. What would be your advice, practical advice for them in terms of moving outside of the silo that you talk about and moving into more community and organisational resilience? So what could be some immediate steps that they could take?
And Sean, do you have a preferred respondent?
Possibly Renae. Yeah.
Sure, Sean, thanks. Great question. So I think the first thing is about educating. So the wheel that I showcased before with all the different business functions, so much happens in solo because no one takes the time and we're all busy doing what we need to do to deliver our jobs. But I think a really good place to start would be to understand and consider what are all the different elements across the different business functions that could integrate with business continuity and progressing into a resilience mindset. So, for example, the external communications or the communications team. So that would be a great, opportunity to go and connect with them, and some of you probably already are, and understand what do they do when a crisis happens or a disaster happens, and then just start learning the interconnectedness and the reliance and how you could potentially work better together. And again, connect with the community team. So a lot of the big corporates, I worked at Australia Post, and led the response to disasters from a community perspective. So every day I spoke with and connected during the Brisbane floods, during that particular disaster, with the business continuity and various other teams. So starting to have holistic conversations where you can understand the different roles that you each play, and then you just organically start working together.
Thanks very much, Renae. Yeah, go, Margaret.
Sean, I'm also cheating because I'm reading a question that's just come up onto the chat. Well, not in the chat, in the questions. So I want to roll the two together. So I would encourage, and I'm trying to do this in the sector that I work in, I would encourage a view that you don't know the answer, that you know a good process and that you follow guidance such as what Renae's just provided, but that you don't know the detailed answer about what's going to work, and that you adopt a curious mindset, my favourite word at the moment, curious mindset, to find out what the answers might be from as many different perspectives as possible. And this leads me to a question that has popped up from Matthew Harper. Thank you, Matthew, saying, you know, are there other examples where the community can actively be involved in infrastructure resilience? And you might think that's a pretty hard partnership to forge. What could the community possibly do about IT or telecommunications or roads and bridges or sewerage? We don't have any role, do we? But I do know of a community that's been working, and it requires a curious mindset from the council and from the providers of the infrastructure to see if there's a way they can let the community help. A land care, it might not officially be called land care, but a nature focused community group, quite strong in North New South Wales, wanted to be involved in clearing all of the flood spillways. I'm not a very infrastructure-y person, but all the channels that are cemented that flood that water out so that it can drain away, whatever that's called, I'm assuming that's infrastructure. And they galvanised community action to clean the weeds out of those so that next flood would actually drain, because they had a small flood and it wouldn't drain because it was full of junk. So there are many ways to partner with communities, but it requires open-mindedness and curiosity to say we could do this together. So there's my answer to Matthew and my answer to Sean. And I'm still wanting you all to think about, have I changed my mind? Do I need to know more about these 3 bits of resilience to do my job? So you're still thinking about that.
Could I just add to both of those questions? Absolutely 100% right. Earlier when we were talking about how practitioners can work, I have this phrase, and many of the people with emergency management backgrounds will know the phrase 3 a.m. friends. So developing those 3 a.m. friends, and you can just do it within your own organisation, be useful in your business continuity role to other elements of the organisation, and be useful to your executive and your board. And you'll get those advocates, you'll get the people, the 3 a.m. friends that will take the phone call at 3 a.m. that says, there's a problem, there's an emergency, we need to react. So build those 3 a.m. friends. I'd really encourage you to do that. I think partnering is the first step towards improving the resilience of yourselves, your organisations, and the community. And the other example I'd add to Margaret's about community resilience, inputting into infrastructure resilience. I've got plenty. Some people may know of the apps that you can get from that talk back to your local council about infrastructure. So if you see a piece of infrastructure and it's not working, you see a water main broken, you can take a photo and send it via an app. Lots of councils are signed up to Snap, Send, Solve, or there are plenty of other versions of this. And you're reporting back about the status of the infrastructure, which allows the infrastructure organisation to remedy that. The really classic example of getting community involved in maintaining your infrastructure is airports. 30 years ago, you'd walk through an airport and you'd see 28 bags lying on the ground and you wouldn't care. You'd just keep going to your plane. But these days, every person in the airport effectively provides an infrastructure resilience function by being part of that security team that is looking to keep the airport safe and therefore keep the airport functioning. So the airports have been really successful at effectively co-opting us into assisting them to maintain the resilience and building the resilience of their infrastructure. And I think there are lessons in that for plenty of other organisations as well. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. I've probably got time for one more question. So Heidi Chapello has a comment and 2 questions. She thinks the slide about unified resilience is very cool, and thanks for collaborating between the 3 of you. Her question is, how did the concept for this collaborative webinar come about, and what resistance or disincentives did you encounter thus far to building a unified approach? It's not directed at anyone particular.
I was going to say, my picture's at the top, so I'm happy to start. So great question. And to be honest with you, it's quite funny because Chris, Margaret and I have all worked in the resilience space for a number of years, and we've crossed paths in various ways, and we all have our own siloed approach and our siloed focus. And it was actually through conversations and through thinking about, well, you know, we should all be working together because we are stronger when we work together. So understanding the work that we had done and recognizing that even though I've done a lot of organizational resilience work, it 100% integrates into community and it integrates into infrastructure as well. So having the knowledge that when we're working together, we are stronger, we decided to, again, present the concept, the fact that if we start looking at each of us separately, but then looking at the interconnectedness, then that will help share with everyone else how what you're doing is not just focused on a siloed outcome. It actually has a holistic element of outcomes as well. And then we just did arm wrestles as to who had the most slides.
Thanks a lot, Renae. Did you want to comment, Margaret or Chris, or there is one more question if you like?
I'm tempted to just say, if you're not familiar, and you may not be, there's something called Australia's vulnerability profile. It's a torturous document. I don't recommend you try to find it and read it. If you work in government, as I've done for many years, it makes sense to me, but it's quite torturous. But conceptually, it demonstrates a real shift in thinking to see things as systems and to see systems in infrastructure, in business, in community as inherently making it more difficult for some segments of our community to recover and building in some vulnerability. And so there's a whole conversation going on at the moment about how to move against that. So in a way, we just want to push this conversation faster and harder because we're just ordinary individuals who happen to really like one another and see potential in such a relationship. Because it didn't automatically mean the three go together. We don't normally go together, but we've just decided to make the concept of working across silos and breaking down these nonsensical separations, we just decided to make it a mission. Kind of.
Agreed. A very brief addendum to that. This isn't just unique to Australasia. This is happening all around the world. Briefly, I've done a large project and some smaller items with Margaret and some smaller items with Renae, and it just spoke to me that we really needed to unify this approach. But this is happening at a worldwide level, and of course COVID's pushing that a little bit, but even before that happened, the United Nations is working on a global risk assessment framework, and it is absolutely taking a systems thinking approach. If you're really interested in it, the GAR, the Global Assessment Report from the United Nations from 2019, the second chapter is all about systems and systemic risk. And I would absolutely, if this interests you like it kind of does me, I'd really encourage you to have a look at that, have a read of that, because I think it provides a good platform for what we're talking about today.
Thank you very much, Chris, Renae and Margaret. I think that's all we've got time for today. So thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and I hope that you've got a few points to take away from today. Just a reminder that the next session starts at 3 p.m, which you can access through the link that was sent to you after registering, and I believe you could also register for it now if you would like. And this webinar will be recorded and available for future reference on the BCI website. And thank you again very much, Chris, Renae and Margaret, and for everyone who joined us today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone today.
Thanks,
Thank you.